The stench of despair. That's the first thing that hits you. Not the iron tang of blood, though that's certainly there, a pervasive undercurrent to the rot, but the cloying, suffocating aroma of hope abandoned. Forget the sanitized movie sets, the flickering torchlight illuminating conveniently placed straw beds. We are talking about depths where light itself fears to tread, where the very stones whisper of cruelty perfected over centuries. Picture, if you dare, a symphony of suffering composed in stone, each chamber a carefully orchestrated movement towards oblivion. 85%. Let that number sink in. 85% of those condemned to these subterranean labyrinths perished within weeks, not from the merciful swiftness of execution, but from the insidious embrace of disease, the gnawing hunger of starvation, and conditions so dehumanizing they would make the most hardened modern correctional officer blanch. This wasn't mere imprisonment, it was systematic soul murder, engineered by minds that understood the human psyche with a chilling, almost surgical precision. Forget luxury hotels. Imagine hell, meticulously planned, flawlessly executed. Every arch, every damp stone, every fetid puddle was a deliberate choice, a calculated step towards ensuring that entry into this realm was, in essence, a living entombment. You believe in human rights, in the inherent dignity of life? Good, you should. But understand that these concepts are fragile, hard-won, and exist precariously above a yawning abyss of potential barbarity. Prepare to be confronted with the uncomfortable truth that civilization is a veneer, easily stripped away, to reveal the primal capacity for systematic cruelty that lurks within us all. The dungeons didn't spring forth fully formed from the earth. They evolved. They festered. They grew. They became history's most efficient instruments of torment through a slow, insidious process. This isn't a tale of individual sadists. It's a chronicle of organized, institutionalized evil, a study in how ordinary individuals, cloaked in the authority of law and sanctioned by societal norms, can perpetrate extraordinary acts of depravity. The chilling truth is this: the story of medieval dungeons isn't just about the past, it's a warning about the present, a chilling reminder of what humanity is capable of, even now. It began, innocently enough, around 800 AD. Charlemagne, in a bid to establish a more structured legal system, introduced imprisonment as a form of punishment. His edicts mentioned subterranean chambers, temporary holding cells for those awaiting trial. Temporary. The word hangs in the air, heavy with irony. The true horror began when those in power realized the potential of prolonged confinement. Swift justice, a clean execution, these were fleeting, easily forgotten. But a slow, agonizing degradation, a meticulously crafted erosion of the spirit, that was something else entirely. A tool, a weapon, a means of control, far more potent than the executioner's axe. By the year 1000, almost every castle, monastery, and major city boasted its own dungeon system. These weren't simply places to store criminals, they were evolving into sophisticated instruments of psychological and physical manipulation. But the true systematization, the chilling professionalization of human suffering, came from an unexpected source: the Catholic Church. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV issued the infamous Ad Extirpanda, a papal bull that officially sanctioned the use of torture to extract confessions from heretics. This wasn't the act of a rogue pontiff, a misguided zealot operating outside the bounds of established doctrine. This was official church policy, transforming torture into a sacred duty, a means of saving souls through the infliction of unimaginable pain. The Church, once a beacon of compassion and solace, weaponized its own doctrines, transforming dungeons from crude holding cells into sophisticated laboratories of psychological warfare. Medieval theologians, steeped in religious dogma, developed elaborate justifications for maximum suffering. Torture, they argued, wasn't cruel.
It was a necessary evil, a means of purifying the soul by forcing confession and repentance. They twisted compassion into a grotesque parody, a justification for systematic cruelty on a scale previously unimaginable. Different regions began to specialize, developing their own unique brands of horror, like medieval franchises of suffering. The Tower of London, with its grim history and imposing presence, perfected the art of high-profile political executions, turning the demise of traitors into a chilling spectacle of royal power. The Château d'Angers in France pioneered the use of noyades, or drowning chambers, dungeons with controllable water levels that could be raised incrementally over weeks, creating a relentless psychological terror without immediately causing death. But perhaps the most devastating innovation, the ultimate expression of institutionalized cruelty, was the oubliette, literally the forgotten place in French. These bottle-shaped chambers, carved into solid rock and accessible only through a hole in the ceiling, served a single, horrifying purpose: complete erasure. Prisoners were lowered into these lightless abysses and simply forgotten. No trial, no execution, no resolution, just a slow, agonizing descent into madness and death, while the world above moved on, oblivious to their suffering. The very architecture of these dungeons reveals their true, chilling purpose. They weren't designed for rehabilitation, for reformation, or even for simple punishment. They were designed to break the human spirit so completely, so utterly, that death became a welcome release. Chambers were deliberately designed to lack windows, ventilation, or drainage, creating an atmosphere of suffocating despair. Built deep underground, often 20 to 40 feet below the surface, screams would be muffled, swallowed by the earth, never reaching the ears of those who might offer solace. Walls were often curved inward, creating a psychological sense of claustrophobia, a feeling of being trapped, crushed, and utterly alone. Over time, castle builders, driven by a perverse sense of competition, began to vie with one another to create the most devastating designs. Some dungeons featured false floors that would collapse without warning, plunging unsuspecting prisoners into pits filled with sharpened stakes. Others included acoustic chambers that amplified every sound, turning the drip of water into a maddening torment, a constant reminder of their isolation and despair. The goal wasn't mere imprisonment, it was the systematic destruction of the human psyche, the deliberate driving of individuals to the brink of insanity. By the High Middle Ages, dungeon construction had become a specialized craft. Master builders, skilled in the art of inflicting suffering, traveled from castle to castle, sharing their innovations, their refinements, their secrets of how to maximize human misery. They were like medieval consultants of cruelty, professionals in the systematic destruction of human dignity, hired to ensure that suffering was administered with maximum efficiency. Medieval justice, if it could be called that, operated on a single, brutal principle. The punishment should be far worse than the crime, and the process of administering that punishment should be even more excruciating than the punishment itself. What, then, could land you in one of these hellish places? The answer reveals just how precarious life was in the medieval world, how easily basic survival could be criminalized, and how readily individuals could be stripped of their rights and condemned to oblivion. The hierarchy of medieval crimes reads like a catalog of societal paranoia, a reflection of the fears and anxieties that gripped the age.
At the very top of the list were crimes against the church, heresy, witchcraft, blasphemy. These were the most heinous of offenses, threatening not only the established social order, but the very fabric of the universe itself. And, crucially, these charges were almost impossible to disprove. Accused of heresy, your very denial was proof of your guilt, because true heretics, of course, would lie to conceal their wicked beliefs. Accused of witchcraft, any misfortune that befell the village, a crop failure, a livestock disease, a sudden death, became irrefutable evidence of your supernatural malevolence. Consider the case of Joan of Arc, a figure whose story has been romanticized and sanitized over the centuries.
She was burned alive for heresy, yes, but her actual crime was far more nuanced, far more politically charged. She wore men's clothing, claimed to have divine visions, and challenged the authority of the church and the English crown. The English, desperate to discredit her and undermine French morale, needed her dead, and they found religious justifications to justify their actions. Her trial transcript, a chilling record of institutional bias, reveals how authorities twisted her every word, her every action, into evidence of supernatural evil. Crimes against nobility were equally broad and equally fatal. Treason could encompass anything from actual rebellion to the mere failure to show proper deference to those in power. William Wallace, the Scottish patriot, endured 6 hours of systematic torture before his execution, not because he posed a genuine military threat to England, but because he dared to challenge the established social order. His punishment was designed to be a spectacle of terror, a brutal warning to anyone else who might consider resisting English rule. But here's where medieval justice takes an even more twisted turn. Property crimes often carried harsher penalties than violent crimes. Stealing anything worth more than 12 pence could result in hanging, while killing someone in a duel might result in nothing more than a fine. Property, it seems, was considered far more valuable than human life. Medieval law also created a number of bizarre and seemingly arbitrary crime categories that reveal the deep-seated social anxieties of the time. Consider the crime of barratry, being too competent as a lawyer. Skilled advocates, it was feared, might undermine judicial authority, challenging the pronouncements of judges and disrupting the smooth functioning of the legal system. Or what about forestalling, buying food before it reached public markets during times of scarcity? This seemingly harmless act was considered a serious offense, as it was believed to drive up prices and exacerbate food shortages, potentially leading to social unrest. Even something as innocuous as night walking, women moving alone after dark, could be criminalized, because female independence was seen as a threat to social stability. Women, in particular, faced a unique set of crimes related to their supposed roles and responsibilities. The scold's bridle, a metal device that was locked around a woman's head to silence her, was a common punishment for talking too much, expressing opinions too forcefully, or otherwise deviating from the expected norms of female behavior. Female adultery was punished far more harshly than male adultery. Prostitutes, deemed to be a source of moral corruption, faced branding with hot irons, while their customers often faced no consequences whatsoever. Religious minorities, particularly Jews, faced systematic criminalization that made it virtually impossible for them to live normal lives. Jews were automatically suspected of usury, lending money at interest, a practice that was forbidden to Christians but economically necessary for the functioning of medieval society. During times of social stress, entire Jewish communities could be arrested and imprisoned on the basis of nothing more than popular hysteria, accused of ritual murder or well poisoning. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval law was the way it criminalized poverty itself. Vagrancy laws made homelessness illegal. Failing to find work was considered idleness, and idleness was also illegal. Begging for food was deemed to be disturbing the peace. In essence, being poor was a crime, punishable by imprisonment, torture, or even death. And children were not exempt from this brutal system. Criminal responsibility began at the age of 7. Children could be imprisoned, tortured, and even executed for stealing fruit, playing in the wrong areas, or simply being orphans with no one to care for them. Medieval society had no concept of juvenile justice. Children were seen as miniature adults, deserving of the same harsh punishments as their elders. Medieval dungeons weren't just holding cells. They were complex social systems with their own hierarchies, economies, and survival strategies. Understanding how these underground societies functioned reveals the full extent of the dehumanization that was inherent in the system. The population of a typical medieval dungeon was carefully stratified by crime, social status, and the ability to pay bribes. At the very top of the hierarchy were high-value political prisoners, captured nobles, rival claimants to thrones, important military leaders. These individuals received relatively luxurious treatment, private cells, monthly straw changes, daily bread and water. Their value lay in their ransom potential, so keeping them alive and reasonably healthy was economically important. The imprisonment of Richard the Lionheart in Germany provides a perfect illustration of this dynamic. Captured while returning from the Crusades, Richard was held for 2 years in relatively comfortable conditions, while his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, frantically raised the enormous ransom demanded by Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. Richard's imprisonment was essentially a business transaction, a carefully calculated suffering designed to extract the maximum payment without killing the asset. Common criminals, debtors, and religious dissidents, on the other hand, had no economic value. 20 or more prisoners might be crammed into spaces designed for 5. They received irregular rations of moldy bread and contaminated water, often going days without any food at all. Life expectancy was measured in weeks, and their deaths were seen as nothing more than administrative conveniences. Heretics and accused witches occupied a special category of horror. Daily torture sessions were aimed not just at extracting confessions, but at saving their souls through suffering. Medieval theologians had convinced themselves that physical agony could purify spiritual corruption, making torture an act of religious mercy. Imagine the psychological trauma of being tortured by people who genuinely believed they were helping you, of being subjected to unimaginable pain in the name of salvation. Children faced conditions that are almost too horrifying to contemplate. Orphans, child thieves, and young vagrants were mixed with adult criminals, subjected to the same brutal treatment. Child mortality rates approached 95% within the first month. Those who survived often became servants or sexual victims of adults, trading their bodies for protection and scraps of food. The internal economy of the dungeon ran on corruption, violence, and desperation. Guards sold basic necessities to those who could afford them. Clean straw could cost a week's wages. Relatively clean water could bankrupt families trying to keep their relatives alive. Fresh bread was more valuable than gold. Prisoners developed their own hierarchies based on length of survival, physical strength, and criminal reputation. Veterans who had survived for months became informal leaders, controlling access to resources and information.
New prisoners were systematically robbed of any valuables, food, and clothing they possessed. The strong preyed on the weak with shocking brutality. Sexual violence was endemic in mixed-gender dungeons. Women were routinely raped by guards, male prisoners, and sometimes even other women, as a means of establishing dominance. Pregnancy meant almost certain death. There were no medical facilities, no clean childbirth conditions, no resources for infant care. Most pregnant prisoners died in childbirth, and babies rarely survived more than a few days. The psychological adaptations of prisoners reveal the full extent of the horror. Many retreated into catatonic withdrawal, escaping the reality of their situation through mental shutdown. Others created elaborate fantasy lives, imagining themselves as royalty, as heroes, as anything that would allow them to retain some semblance of dignity and hope. Some turned to extreme religious devotion, convincing themselves that their suffering was divinely ordained, a test of their faith, a path to salvation. But perhaps the most disturbing adaptation was how quickly ordinary people became complicit in cruelty. Prisoners informed on each other for small advantages, betraying their fellow inmates to gain a few extra scraps of food or a slightly better position. They participated in the abuse of weaker inmates in order to avoid becoming victims themselves. They stole food from dying prisoners, justifying it as a necessity for their own survival. The dungeon system corrupted everyone it touched, turning victims into perpetrators and destroying the moral foundations that held communities together. Medieval torture wasn't random violence. It was a sophisticated pain technology designed to extract confessions, punish specific crimes, and terrorize populations into submission.
The systematic nature of medieval torture reveals how ordinary people can become participants in extraordinary evil when cruelty is institutionalized and justified by those in power. Torture methods varied depending on the type of crime and the social status of the victim. Religious crimes, heresy, witchcraft, blasphemy, were considered the most serious because they threatened the spiritual order that held the universe together. These crimes required not only physical agony, but psychological devastation. The strappado was a favorite method for extracting confessions from heretics. The victim's hands were tied behind their back and attached to a rope that ran through a pulley in the ceiling. They would then be lifted by their arms, dislocating their shoulders and causing excruciating pain. Sometimes weights would be attached to their feet to increase the damage. The beauty of the strappado, from the torturer's perspective, was that it could continue for hours without killing the victim, allowing for prolonged interrogation. The Spanish boot was another popular method, used to slowly and methodically crush the bones of the leg. The victim's leg was placed in a metal boot, which was then tightened with screws. As the pressure increased, the bones would crack audibly, often causing more psychological distress to witnesses than to the victim themselves. The Spanish boot could reduce a human leg to a mass of pulverized tissue, while keeping the victim conscious and able to speak. Political crimes, on the other hand, demanded publicly visible methods, designed to send a message and reinforce the power of the state. Drawing and quartering was a theatrical performance of state power, a carefully choreographed ritual of pain and degradation. The victim would be dragged through the streets tied to a horse, hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled while still alive, and then beheaded and quartered. Each stage of the process had a symbolic meaning. Dragging represented social fall. Hanging symbolized justice. Disemboweling exposed inner corruption. And quartering completely destroyed the individual's identity. Flaying, the removal of a person's skin while they were still alive, was reserved for the most serious political crimes. The process, if done skillfully, could take hours, with the victim remaining conscious throughout. Witnessing a human being reduced to exposed muscle and bone while still breathing and screaming was a potent demonstration of absolute political authority. The brazen bull combined physical agony with psychological terror. The victim was locked inside a hollow bronze bull, which was then heated over a fire, slowly roasting the person alive. The cruel twist was that the bull was designed with acoustic chambers that transformed the victim's screams into a sound resembling the bellowing of a bull, dehumanizing them even as they died. Moral crimes, such as adultery, prostitution, and homosexuality, required both pain and humiliation. The pillory was a common punishment for these offenses. The victim would be placed in a wooden frame, immobilizing them and exposing them to public abuse. Citizens would throw rotten food, waste, and stones at the pilloried criminal, subjecting them to physical discomfort and profound psychological damage. The psychological effects of this public spectacle often lasted far longer than the physical injuries. The ducking stool was a particularly cruel punishment targeted at women accused of being scolds. Talking too much, expressing opinions too forcefully, or otherwise challenging male authority. The victim would be strapped to a chair on a lever system that repeatedly plunged her underwater until she was near drowning, then pulled up to recover, and then dunked again. The process could continue for hours, and many women died from water inhalation or hypothermia. Medieval torturers also developed sophisticated psychological techniques designed to break victims without leaving permanent physical damage. Water torture, for example, involved placing a cloth over the victim's face and slowly pouring water onto it, creating the sensation of drowning without actually killing them. This method left no visible injuries, but it caused extreme psychological trauma. Sleep deprivation was another effective technique for breaking mental resistance over extended periods. Victims would be kept awake for days or even weeks through constant noise, bright lights, or physical prodding. The effects were devastating: hallucinations, paranoia, and complete mental breakdown. Many prisoners would confess to anything, true or false, just to be allowed to sleep. Temperature manipulation involved alternately exposing victims to extreme heat and extreme cold, never allowing their bodies to adapt. This created constant discomfort while avoiding permanent damage that might kill the victim before they confess. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval torture was how it was justified and systematized. Educated clergy and legal scholars wrote detailed torture manuals, providing instructions for maximizing pain while minimizing the risk of accidental death. These weren't sadistic individuals acting on impulse. They were professionals implementing official policies designed by some of the most educated minds in medieval society. The real killers in medieval dungeons weren't the executioners or the torture devices themselves. They were the diseases that thrived in the perfect storm of overcrowding, poor sanitation, malnutrition, and contaminated water. Disease made imprisonment essentially a death sentence, even without the deliberate violence of torture. Plague was the most feared killer. Dungeons were ideal breeding grounds for rats and fleas, which spread the bubonic plague. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people across Europe, but dungeon populations were hit even harder, as they had no way to flee infected areas or improve their living conditions.
Symptoms appeared within days: fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, and the characteristic buboes, or swollen lymph nodes. Mortality rates in confined populations approached 90%. Typhus, spread by body lice that thrived in the unwashed and overcrowded conditions of dungeons, caused high fever, severe headaches, and delirium. Victims developed characteristic rashes and often died within 2 weeks. Typhus was so common in prisons that it earned the name jail fever. Dysentery was perhaps the most common killer of all. Contaminated water and poor sanitation caused severe, often bloody diarrhea, leading to rapid dehydration and death. Where clean water was unavailable and human waste accumulated in living spaces, dysentery could kill entire cell populations within weeks. It created vicious cycles. Victims became too weak to maintain basic hygiene, spreading the infection to others. Tuberculosis, or TB, thrived in confined, poorly ventilated spaces. The disease spread through airborne droplets when infected prisoners coughed, making infection almost inevitable in close quarters. TB was a slow killer. Victims wasted away over months, coughing up blood and becoming progressively weaker. The prolonged nature of the illness meant that infected prisoners spread it to many others before they finally died. Malnutrition was also systematically fatal. Prison rations were calculated to keep prisoners alive just long enough to serve their purpose, whether that was extracting confessions, awaiting trial, or providing labor. The typical diet, moldy bread, thin gruel, contaminated water, lacked essential vitamins, leading to scurvy, beriberi, and kwashiorkor. Scurvy was particularly horrifying. Victims' teeth would loosen and fall out, their gums would bleed constantly, and old wounds would reopen as their bodies lost the ability to maintain connective tissue. Watching your body literally fall apart was often as devastating as the physical symptoms. Infected wounds were death sentences in a world without antibiotics, antiseptics, or even basic wound care. Gangrene was common and usually fatal. The smell of rotting flesh from gangrenous wounds added to the already overwhelming stench of the dungeon. The way that bodies were disposed of reveals the complete dehumanization of the system. Dead prisoners were removed weekly, if the authorities even remembered. Bodies were dragged out like garbage and thrown into mass graves or fed to pigs. No identification, no family notification, no religious ceremonies. People simply disappeared, as if they had never existed. The psychological impact on survivors was devastating. Living surrounded by death, watching fellow prisoners waste away, knowing that the same fate awaited them, created anticipatory grief that broke many people's will to live. Some deliberately exposed themselves to fatal diseases to end their suffering more quickly. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all was how disease was weaponized by the authorities.
Overcrowding wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate policy designed to increase mortality rates. Contaminated water wasn't the result of poor administration. It was a cost-saving measure that treated prisoner deaths as acceptable losses. You won't learn about this in most history classes. The medieval justice system created conditions that were far more lethal than most torture devices, achieving its aims through systematic neglect rather than active cruelty. The most notorious medieval dungeons became legendary for their refinement of systematic human destruction. Each developed its own specialties and innovations in suffering, which then influenced dungeon design across Europe. Examining these cases reveals how institutional cruelty became a source of professional pride and political power. The Tower of London's Bloody Tower represents political imprisonment as theater. Built by William the Conqueror in 1078, it specialized in destroying high-profile victims. Everyone knew that entering the tower usually meant death, but the process would be slow, public, and designed for maximum humiliation. Anne Boleyn's case illustrates how the tower functioned as a stage for royal power. Accused of adultery, incest, and treason, she was held in the very same rooms where she had prepared for her coronation just 3 years earlier. The irony was deliberate. Henry VIII wanted her to understand how completely her status had been reversed, how utterly she had fallen from grace. Her execution used a specially imported French swordsman, supposedly as an act of mercy, because beheading with a sword was faster and more efficient than the traditional axe. Thomas More's imprisonment reveals how the tower broke intellectual resistance. The former Lord Chancellor and author of Utopia was imprisoned for refusing to acknowledge Henry VIII's supremacy over the Church of England. Jailers used psychological torture, isolating him from books, paper, and human contact to break down his scholarly identity. When physical torture failed to extract the required oath, they simply kept him in harsh conditions until his health failed. The Bastille in Paris became synonymous with royal tyranny because of its lettres de cachet, sealed letters that allowed the king to imprison anyone without trial or explanation. The horror of the Bastille wasn't the existence of torture chambers, but its ability to make people disappear completely. Families never knew what happened to relatives who were taken to the Bastille. Prisoners could be held for decades without any legal recourse. The most famous Bastille prisoner was the man in the Iron Mask, who was held for over 30 years and forced to wear a black velvet mask whenever he was seen. His identity remains unknown, but his case illustrates the Bastille's function as a place where inconvenient people could be erased from history. Being forced to hide your identity for decades was, in many ways, more devastating than physical punishment. Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome served as the Pope's personal prison and was notorious for its religious torture methods. Built on the site of Emperor Hadrian's tomb, the castle's dungeons housed heretics and enemies of the Papal States. The irony of using a pagan emperor's mausoleum to torture Christians who disagreed with church doctrine was not lost on anyone. Giordano Bruno, the philosopher and astronomer, was held there for 8 years before being burned alive for heresy in 1600. His crime was proposing that the universe was infinite and contained multiple worlds, contradicting church teaching. His imprisonment was designed to give him time to recant and save his soul, but Bruno refused to abandon his scientific beliefs. The castle's oubliettes were particularly cruel innovations. These bottle-shaped chambers were carved into the rock foundations, accessible only through holes in the ceiling. Prisoners were lowered down and literally forgotten. Some were designed to flood during heavy rains, creating a constant psychological terror of potential drowning that could last for hours or even days. The Château d'Angers pioneered the use of drowning chambers, dungeons with controllable water levels that could be slowly flooded over prolonged periods for maximum psychological torture. The Marquis de Sade was imprisoned there for 13 years, and his writings reveal the psychological impact of living under the constant threat of drowning. Water levels were controlled by guards, who could raise or lower them based on the prisoner's cooperation. These notorious dungeons shared a number of systematic features that reveal the true nature of medieval imprisonment.